Ethan's life takes a surprising turn when he returns a lost briefcase full of cash to its rightful owner, a wealthy man named Graham. Touched by Ethan's honesty, Graham becomes his mentor, inspiring Ethan to build a community center to help those in need, just as he was once helped. But as Ethan's center grows, so do the obstacles. He faces unexpected betrayals, battles community prejudice, and wrestles with the challenge of staying true to his mission. With each test, Ethan learns that kindness takes courage and loyalty. Will Ethan find the strength to carry on Graham's legacy? Stick around to find out. If stories of resilience and hope move you, be sure to subscribe, like, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let's jump into Ethan's incredible journey. Ethan Green shivered as the first icy gusts of an autumn wind swept through the streets of Willowbrook, his thin, tattered jacket barely holding back the chill. He had grown used to the bite of cold air and hunger's persistent gnawing, but today seemed colder than ever. The street, lined with sleepy storefronts and a scattering of early risers, seemed to stretch endlessly before him, echoing with the sounds of morning rush, a stark contrast to his quiet, shadowed world. He moved cautiously through the early morning bustle, his eyes trained on the ground, taking care not to draw attention. At 10 years old, Ethan had already learned to make himself invisible. Invisibility was safety. Safety was survival. He had no desire for pity or sneers, both of which he'd seen directed his way too often. Most passers-by seemed happy enough to ignore the scrappy kid in worn-out sneakers, his once brown hair messy and unkempt, his eyes large and hollow. To them, he was just another child lost to the streets, a nuisance, a burden. Ethan's stomach growled, and he grimaced, instinctively hugging his arms to his chest. He scanned his surroundings, his gaze landing on the small bakery he'd taken to waiting near on weekends, hoping for a kind glance or perhaps a discarded roll. Today, the warm sense of fresh bread and cinnamon rolls teased him from just behind the bakery's glass window. For a moment, he allowed himself to stare, entranced by the sight of a family inside, laughing over breakfast. He felt a pang in his chest, something far deeper than hunger. They were so absorbed in their joy, their togetherness, that they hadn't noticed the boy just outside, watching with a blend of longing and sadness. "Hey, kid," barked a voice from behind him. Ethan startled, instinctively stepping back. A shopkeeper was glaring at him, a broom in hand, eyebrows drawn together in irritation. "This isn't a place for loitering," he snapped. "Move along now." Ethan lowered his gaze, mumbling an apology as he turned and shuffled away, willing himself not to look back at the bakery. The loneliness settled over him again, as heavy and cold as the chill in the air. With one last look down the street, he continued his daily routine, wandering without destination, seeking nothing but shelter and survival. A little while later, Ethan's luck seemed to change in the most unexpected way. He was cutting through an alley to avoid the glare of a patrolling police officer when something caught his eye, a black leather briefcase, lying abandoned on the wet ground. It looked slightly scuffed, but undeniably expensive, as if it had been hurriedly tossed aside. Ethan's heart raced. He glanced around, half expecting someone to come running back for it. When no one did, he took a tentative step forward, the thought of opening the case filling him with an almost unbearable curiosity. His hands trembled as he bent down to inspect it. With a quick intake of breath, he lifted the latch. Inside, his gaze was met with neat stacks of cash, each note more pristine than the last. For a long, breathless moment, he simply stared, mesmerized. This money could change everything. With this, he could buy food, new clothes, maybe even find somewhere warm to sleep. For the first time in what felt like forever, he could imagine a different life. He picked up a stack of bills, the weight of the crisp paper alien in his hand. He could feel the sudden swell of possibility mingling with the sense of disbelief. But as he looked at the money, an unwelcome voice echoed in his mind, the voice of his mother from long ago. "Always be honest, Ethan," she used to say, her voice gentle but firm. "No matter how hard life gets, don't lose who you are." He closed his eyes, her face swimming to the forefront of his memory, so clear it was almost painful. She was gone now, but her words remained, resonating deeply within him. A part of him felt compelled to honor her, to resist the lure of easy escape. Just then, he heard a voice, gruff and tinged with weariness. "Hey, kid!" Ethan's eyes snapped open. Standing a few yards away was a man in a wheelchair, his face worn but kind, his eyes tired yet sharp. He was older, perhaps in his 60s, with graying hair neatly combed back, dressed in a crisp black suit that spoke of wealth and influence. His gaze was fixed on Ethan, his mouth set in a line of both curiosity and suspicion. "Did you find a briefcase?" the man asked, his tone neither accusing nor gentle. Ethan's hands tightened around the handle of the case, and for a fleeting second, he considered running. But his mother's voice rang out again, and he found himself stepping forward, heart pounding. "Yes, sir," he replied softly, extending the briefcase toward the man. "It's right here." The man's face softened, surprise glinting in his eyes as he took the case. He glanced at Ethan, the hint of a smile forming. "Not many kids would do what you just did, you know." Ethan lowered his gaze, a faint blush warming his cheeks. It's just what my mom would have wanted me to do." The man studied him for a moment, his gaze turning more thoughtful. "What's your name, son?" "Ethan, sir." "Ethan Green." The man extended a hand, which Ethan tentatively took. "Graham Foster," he introduced himself with a nod. "Thank you, Ethan. You may have just saved me a lot of trouble." They stood in silence for a moment, Graham taking in the boy's ragged appearance, the shadows beneath his eyes, the haunted look of a child who had seen far more than his years should allow. "You're alone out here, aren't you?" Graham asked, his voice softened by an undertone of compassion. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. His gaze dropped, but he gave a small nod. Graham sighed, a mixture of pity and frustration flickering across his features. "Tell you what, Ethan, why don't you come with me? I could use someone with your honesty. And you look like you could use a meal." Ethan hesitated, glancing down the empty street. The thought of following a stranger went against every instinct he'd learned on the streets. But something in Graham's gaze, the kindness, the patience, gave him pause. He nodded, slowly at first, then with greater conviction. "Thank you, sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Graham nodded, gesturing for his driver to help Ethan into the car. As the doors closed around him and the warmth of the vehicle embraced him, Ethan felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, hope. Ethan stared out the window as the car wound its way through Willowbrook's wealthy district, a world so different from the one he had known. The houses grew larger, their lawns meticulously maintained, gates and fences rising high, as if to guard a world Ethan had only ever glimpsed from afar. The car finally came to a stop before an imposing mansion, its brick facade softened by ivy crawling up the walls, windows lined with elegant shutters. It was nothing short of breathtaking, a place that felt as far removed from Ethan's reality as a dream. "Come on, Ethan," Graham said, gesturing toward the grand entrance. As they stepped inside, Ethan found himself surrounded by high ceilings, glittering chandeliers, and rooms that stretched farther than he could imagine. Marble floors gleamed beneath his feet, reflecting the soft glow of antique lamps and framed art that seemed to tell stories of another time. He felt small, his ragged clothes and dirt-streaked face out of place in the splendor around him. "This will be your home, as long as you need it," Graham told him, his voice carrying a sincerity that left Ethan speechless. Just as he was beginning to feel overwhelmed by the luxury, a tall, slender man appeared, his eyes cold and calculating as they assessed Ethan. The man was dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, his face fixed in a look of barely concealed disdain. "Malcolm," Graham said, introducing the man with a nod. "This is Ethan. He'll be staying with us." Malcolm's lips thinned as he glanced at Ethan, a flicker of disapproval crossing his face. "Very well, sir," he replied, his tone clipped and impersonal. He shot Ethan a look that sent a shiver down his spine, as if silently conveying that he didn't belong here. Graham didn't seem to notice, or perhaps he simply ignored Malcolm's reaction. He placed a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder, steering him toward a grand staircase. "Come on, Ethan. Let's find you a room." As they walked, Ethan couldn't help but glance back, feeling Malcolm's gaze on him, cold and unwelcoming. But he shook it off, focusing on the warmth in Graham's voice, the quiet kindness that made him feel, for the first time in ages, like he wasn't completely alone. Graham led Ethan through a labyrinth of corridors and up a narrow staircase that seemed to stretch endlessly upward. By the time they reached the top, Ethan was out of breath, though he'd tried his best to hide it, afraid of appearing weak in this new, unfamiliar world. At the end of the hall, Graham opened a door to a small room, sparsely furnished but comfortable, a bed, a dresser, and a window that overlooked the garden below. The room had a cozy, slightly worn feel, with faded wallpaper and a quilt that looked handmade. To Ethan, it felt like a sanctuary. "This is where you'll stay," Graham said, his voice gentle. "It's not as grand as some of the other rooms, but it's quiet and private. I thought you might like that." Ethan nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. He ran his fingers over the edge of the bed, marveling at how soft and inviting it looked. It had been years since he'd slept in anything but alleyways and abandoned buildings. "Get some rest," Graham encouraged him, his gaze warm but perceptive. "I'll have someone bring you a hot meal. Take your time settling in. You're safe here, Ethan." As Graham turned to leave, Ethan felt a sudden pang of gratitude and something else, a feeling that stirred from the depths of his being, something he hadn't felt in as long as he could remember: trust. "Thank you, Mr. Foster," he whispered, barely loud enough for Graham to hear. Graham paused, nodding once before closing the door softly behind him. Ethan sank down onto the bed, his fingers gripping the quilt as if it might disappear at any moment. He lay back, staring up at the ceiling, unable to shake the fear that this was all a fleeting dream. He would wake up tomorrow and find himself back on the street, alone and forgotten. It wasn't long before there was a soft knock at the door. A woman in her late 40s with a kind face and hands worn from years of work entered, carrying a tray. She set it down on a small table by the bed. "You must be Ethan," she said with a warm smile. "I'm Margaret. I run the kitchen here. Mr. Foster told me you might need a bit of a welcome meal." Ethan's mouth watered as he looked at the steaming bowl of soup, a thick slice of buttered bread, and a small cup of apple juice. "Thank you, ma'am," he murmured, barely able to tear his gaze from the food. "Go on. Eat while it's hot," she encouraged, folding her hands and watching him with motherly care. "There's plenty more if you're still hungry." Hesitantly, Ethan picked up the spoon and took a small sip of the soup. The flavors were rich and soothing, filling him with a warmth he'd almost forgotten was possible. As he ate, he caught Margaret watching him, her gaze softening. "You know, I grew up in a house a bit like this," she said more to herself than to him. "Not quite as fancy, but a home's a home. And Mr. Foster, well, he has a way of making people feel welcome. Don't be afraid to ask if you need anything." Ethan swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. He wanted to tell her he didn't deserve this kindness, that he'd done nothing to earn it. But instead, he just nodded, managing a faint smile. As Margaret left, Ethan finished the meal slowly, savoring every bite. He hadn't realized how hungry he was until the tray was empty, his stomach full for the first time in days. Later that evening, Ethan wandered downstairs, exploring the house in quiet awe. He moved through the rooms cautiously, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, afraid to touch anything. The art on the walls, the gleaming furniture, even the grand staircase. All of it felt like another world, a world he didn't belong in. He was passing the parlor when he heard voices. Graham was speaking to someone, his tone warm but firm. Ethan hesitated, glancing around the corner. There, facing Graham, was Malcolm, his posture stiff and his gaze cold as it rested on Ethan. "I'm not sure what your intentions are, Mr. Foster," Malcolm was saying, his voice low. "But I must warn you, taking an estray off the street can bring all sorts of trouble. I just want to ensure you're aware of that." Graham's expression remained steady, though his eyes flicked toward Ethan, who had now backed into the shadows. "This boy is a guest in my home," Graham replied, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "I expect you to treat him with the same respect as anyone else who crosses this threshold." Malcolm's eyes narrowed, his gaze sharp. Of course, sir, but respect is earned, not given freely. Without another word, Malcolm turned on his heel, striding away. Ethan pressed himself back against the wall, his heart pounding. The encounter had filled him with a strange mix of fear and shame, as if he were an imposter who had slipped into a world where he didn't belong. The next morning, Graham invited Ethan to join him for a walk through the gardens. The sun had just risen, casting a soft, golden light over the manicured lawns and flower beds that lined the gravel paths. They walked in silence for a while, Graham in his wheelchair and Ethan keeping pace beside him, glancing occasionally at the older man's calm expression. I have a few things I want to talk to you about, Ethan, Graham began, his voice thoughtful. Life has not been easy for you, has it? Ethan looked away, unsure how to respond. The answer was obvious, but it felt strange to say it aloud. He finally gave a small nod. No, he admitted quietly. Graham nodded, his gaze distant. You remind me of myself when I was younger. I didn't come from much either, you know. But along the way, I met people who helped me, people who saw something in me that I hadn't even seen in myself. Sometimes, all it takes is one person believing in you. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat, surprised by how much the words resonated with him. He glanced at Graham, his mind racing with questions but his heart too overwhelmed to voice any of them. They walked a little further, passing a row of roses, their petals of vivid red against the green. Graham's voice softened as he continued. I don't know what the future holds for you, Ethan, but if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the world is full of possibilities. Sometimes, they're hidden beneath layers of hardship and fear. But they're there, waiting for the right moment. Ethan felt his chest tighten, something like hope flickering to life within him. Thank you, sir, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, son, Graham replied, resting a hand on Ethan's shoulder. Just remember that you're not alone. Not anymore. As they turned back toward the house, Ethan couldn't help but feel a shift in his heart. The mansion, with its sprawling grounds and grand halls, was beginning to feel less like a cold and imposing fortress and more like a home. The next few days passed in a quiet routine, with Ethan finding himself slowly settling into life at the mansion. Graham kept him close, involving him in daily tasks around the estate, introducing him to the handful of staff members who maintained the grounds and the house's upkeep. While most were friendly, Ethan noticed the undercurrent of tension whenever Malcolm was near. The butler's disdain had only grown, and though he never voiced it openly in Graham's presence, his disapproving glares were unmistakable. Malcolm had a way of making Ethan feel small and unworthy, his cutting glances a constant reminder of the life he'd left behind. One afternoon, Ethan was helping Graham organize books in the library when Malcolm appeared, his expression carefully neutral. Sir, I need to remind you that the Hendersons are arriving tomorrow evening, Malcolm said, his tone polite but clipped. It might be wise to reconsider certain arrangements. Graham looked up, his gaze steady. Is there something you wish to say, Malcolm? Malcolm glanced at Ethan, his lips pressed into a thin line. Only that some of our guests may find it unexpected to see certain individuals in your company. Ethan felt his face flush with embarrassment and anger, but he kept his gaze on the floor. Graham's voice was calm but firm. Ethan is my guest, and anyone who cannot accept him in my home has no place here. Malcolm's expression tightened, his jaw clenched, but he nodded stiffly, bowing his head in reluctant acquiescence. Very well, sir. As Malcolm exited the room, Graham turned to Ethan, his expression softening. You'll get used to him. He has a lot to learn about kindness, but I've always believed that actions speak louder than words. Just remember, you have a right to be here, just as much as anyone else. Ethan nodded, though he couldn't shake the unease Malcolm's words had stirred in him. He wanted to believe Graham's assurance, but a part of him still felt as if he were trespassing in a world that wasn't meant for him. The following evening, Ethan stood by Graham's side as the Hendersons, a wealthy couple known for their influence in the community, arrived. Mr. Henderson was tall and impeccably dressed, his smile courteous but distant. Mrs. Henderson wore a jeweled necklace that glinted in the light, her gaze sweeping the room before settling briefly on Ethan. She offered a polite smile, though her eyes held a flicker of curiosity and something colder beneath the surface. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, painfully aware of his place. Graham, however, greeted them warmly, introducing Ethan as his guest without a hint of hesitation. He spoke of Ethan with pride, his voice filling with warmth as he shared how they had met and the quiet resilience he admired in the boy. Though Ethan felt out of place, he couldn't help but feel a glimmer of pride. For the first time, someone was standing up for him, making him feel like he belonged. As the evening wore on, Ethan remained quietly in the background, observing the interaction between Graham and his guests. He noticed how effortlessly Graham commanded respect, his kindness a far cry from the wealth and arrogance he had often witnessed from afar. In Graham's presence, Ethan felt something he'd never truly felt before: dignity. The days after the Hendersons' visit were a blend of routine and tension for Ethan. He found himself getting used to certain comforts: the soft bed, regular meals, and even small conversations with Graham, who had an endless supply of stories. It was a strange but wonderful rhythm, and for a brief moment, Ethan began to think he might actually fit in this new life. But Malcolm had other plans. The butler's subtle jabs turned into overt hostility, though he was careful to keep it out of Graham's sight. Malcolm's disapproval lingered in the house like a shadow, coloring even the happiest moments. One morning, as Ethan entered the dining room, he found Malcolm laying out breakfast. The older man shot him a sidelong glance before turning his attention to the tray. "Enjoying the high life? Aren't you?" he muttered, his voice low but clear. "Quite an upgrade from the streets." Ethan stiffened but said nothing, instinctively drawing back. Malcolm continued, a thin smile spreading across his face. "Don't get too comfortable, boy. Mr. Foster may have a soft spot for stray animals, but this is no shelter. People will talk, and soon enough, he'll realize he's better off without you hanging around." The words stung, slicing through the fragile sense of belonging Ethan had begun to feel. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to meet Malcolm's gaze. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Mr. Foster invited me." Malcolm raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Invited you, yes? But let's be clear, you don't belong here." Without another word, Malcolm walked out, leaving Ethan alone in the silence. He sat down at the table, staring at the breakfast spread before him, but his appetite had disappeared. Malcolm's words echoed in his mind, each one a reminder that he was still an outsider, no matter how much he wished otherwise. Later that evening, Graham called Ethan into his study. The room, lined with bookshelves and a faint scent of old leather, was dimly lit by the fire crackling in the hearth. Graham looked tired, his gaze distant as he stared into the flames. "Sit down, Ethan," he said, gesturing to a leather armchair across from him. Ethan sat, glancing nervously at the older man, sensing that something weighed heavily on his mind. Graham finally turned his gaze toward him, his expression softening. "I want to talk to you about Malcolm," he began, pausing as if searching for the right words. "I know he's not the most welcoming person. His loyalty has always been to the family's traditions and reputation, not necessarily to me as a person." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, wondering if Graham had noticed Malcolm's hostility. "Malcolm has been with the family for years," Graham continued, "and while I trust him with my estate, he doesn't always see things the way I do. I'm telling you this because I know he can make you feel unwelcome, but that doesn't mean he speaks for me." Ethan felt a lump in his throat, a mixture of relief and gratitude warming his chest. "Thank you, sir," he murmured, struggling to keep his voice steady. Graham smiled, his gaze softening. "You're more than welcome here, Ethan. I want you to feel that. But I also want you to be prepared. There will be people like Malcolm, people who judge you without knowing your story. The key is to remember your own worth and not let their words define you." Ethan nodded, his heart swelling with a fierce determination. For so long, he had let others' opinions shape how he saw himself. But Graham's words planted a new seed of strength within him. He was beginning to understand that he didn't have to hide or apologize for who he was. Perhaps he could find a place in this world after all. Despite Graham's reassurance, Malcolm's hostility continued to escalate. He took every opportunity to make Ethan's life difficult, assigning him menial tasks and watching him with a sharp, critical gaze. One afternoon, as Ethan was dusting the shelves in the library, Malcolm entered, his gaze colder than usual. "Look at you, pretending to be one of us," Malcolm sneered, crossing his arms. "You think just because Mr. Foster gave you a roof and some clean clothes, you're suddenly part of this family?" Ethan swallowed, meeting Malcolm's gaze but saying nothing. Malcolm stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Listen carefully, boy. You may have Mr. Foster fooled, but I know better. You're a stray and nobody, and I will do whatever it takes to protect this house from the likes of you." Ethan's hands tightened around the feather duster, his jaw clenched. "I haven't done anything wrong," he replied, keeping his voice steady. Malcolm scoffed, a hint of satisfaction in his eyes. "That's where you're wrong. Your very presence here is a stain on this household. You don't belong, and you never will." With that, Malcolm turned and left, leaving Ethan standing alone in the silence, the weight of his words pressing down like a heavy stone. Ethan's resolve was tested further when, a few days later, Graham's niece and nephew visited the mansion. Marcus and Lily were older, both in their 20s, and had an air of entitlement that made Ethan uneasy. They greeted Graham warmly, but when they noticed Ethan, their expressions turned wary. "Who's this?" Marcus asked, giving Ethan a scrutinizing look. Graham smiled, his tone as warm as ever. "This is Ethan. He's been staying with me for a while now." Lily arched an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Interesting," she murmured, glancing at Marcus. "I didn't realize you were fostering Uncle Graham." Ethan felt his cheeks flush, sensing their silent judgment. They exchanged a look, and he knew that he was an outsider in their eyes, an inconvenience to be tolerated but never truly accepted. Graham didn't miss their reaction. He reached over, giving Ethan a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Ethan is a guest here, and I expect you to treat him with respect," he said, his voice steady. Marcus and Lily exchanged another look, but they said nothing more on the subject. They spent the afternoon chatting with Graham about business and social affairs, their conversation peppered with subtle barbs and hints of condescension. Every now and then, they'd cast glances at Ethan, as if reminding him of his place. By the time they left, Ethan's chest felt tight with frustration and hurt. He had hoped that maybe, just maybe, he could find a family here, but Marcus and Lily's judgmental stares had reminded him of the harsh truth. He was still a stranger in their world. One evening, as Ethan was helping Graham organize old paperwork, he stumbled upon an envelope buried among some documents. It was old, the paper yellowed, and the edges frayed. Curiosity piqued. He hesitated before handing it to Graham. Graham took the envelope, his eyes widening slightly as he recognized it. "Ah, this," he murmured, his expression thoughtful. He opened it carefully, pulling out a single sheet of paper. As he read, a faint smile appeared on his face, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "It's from an old friend," he explained, glancing at Ethan. "We grew up together, but life took us in different directions. She wrote to me many years ago, reminding me of what truly matters in life." Ethan listened quietly, sensing the emotion in Graham's voice. "You see, Ethan, sometimes people can become so focused on wealth and success that they lose sight of kindness and compassion," Graham continued. "This letter was a reminder to me, a call to stay grounded, to never forget that a person's worth is measured by their heart, not their wealth." Ethan absorbed Graham's words, feeling a surge of respect for the man. He had always thought that wealth changed people, that it created walls around the heart. But Graham seemed different, a beacon of hope in a world that often felt cold and unkind. As they finished organizing the papers, Ethan found himself more determined than ever to prove that he could belong in this world. Not because of money or status, but because of who he was. Over time, a quiet bond developed between Ethan and Graham. They shared many small moments, reading together in the library, working side by side in the garden, even sharing silent walks through the house at night. Graham's patience and kindness began to heal the wounds that life on the streets had left on Ethan's heart. But Malcolm's disdain remained a constant, a dark cloud over their growing connection. Ethan did his best to ignore the butler's sharp words and cold stares, focusing instead on the rare peace he found in Graham's company. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Graham turned to Ethan, his expression serious. "Ethan, there's something I want to offer you," he said, his voice soft. "I want you to consider staying here, not just as a guest, but as a part of my family." Ethan's heart raced, the words almost too overwhelming to comprehend. He had longed for a place to belong, but he had never dared to hope that he could find it here, in a mansion filled with people who saw him as an outsider. I don't know what to say," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You don't have to say anything now," Graham replied, his gaze warm and reassuring. "Just know that the offer is open. Take your time. Think about it. I want you to feel truly at home here." Ethan nodded, unable to keep the smile from spreading across his face. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt like he had a future, a path that didn't lead back to the streets. Graham's offer was a lifeline, a chance at a life he had only dreamed of. As he lay in bed that night, Ethan stared up at the ceiling, his mind racing with possibilities. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Malcolm's resentment was sure to grow, and Marcus and Lily would likely resist his place in the family. But in that moment, none of it mattered. He had been given a chance, and he was determined to make the most of it. The days following Graham's offer were a blur for Ethan, his mind filled with a mix of excitement and doubt. He had been given a chance to join a family, a real family, something he had dreamed of for so long but had never thought possible. And yet, a part of him still hesitated, the old fears and insecurities whispering that this was too good to be true. Graham encouraged him gently, never pressuring him, only reminding him now and then that his door would always be open. Ethan found himself becoming more involved around the estate, helping Graham with small tasks and spending more time in the gardens, where he would quietly tend to the plants as a way to calm his racing mind. One evening, as he was weeding a bed of roses, Graham joined him, rolling his wheelchair across the gravel path with a serene smile. "Ethan," he said, watching as the boy carefully pruned the plants, "I hope you know that whatever decision you make, you'll always have a place here." Ethan looked up, meeting Graham's gaze. "Thank you, sir. I think I'm just afraid of disappointing you." Graham's expression softened. "Ethan, the only thing that would ever disappoint me is if you stop being yourself. All I ask is that you stay true to the person I see before me." Ethan felt a surge of confidence, bolstered by Graham's quiet faith in him. He nodded, a small but genuine smile breaking across his face. "I'll do my best, sir." But as he stood there, he couldn't shake the feeling that not everyone in the household shared Graham's vision of him. While Graham's kindness had been unwavering, Malcolm had been growing increasingly bitter. The butler was convinced that Ethan's presence threatened the household's dignity, and he watched the boy with a mixture of suspicion and disdain. Seeing Graham's growing attachment to Ethan only solidified Malcolm's resolve to put an end to it. Late one night, Malcolm and Marcus met in the library, where their hushed voices drifted through the darkened hall. They both shared a mutual understanding of what they believed was best for the household, an understanding that did not include Ethan. "I think you and I both know what's at stake here, Malcolm," Marcus muttered, his fingers tapping on the polished wood of the library desk. "Uncle Graham is getting older, and we can't risk him handing over everything he's worked for to some street kid." Malcolm nodded, his gaze cold and calculating. "Precisely. This boy brings nothing but shame to this house. And yet, Mr. Foster seems blind to the threat he poses." Marcus's face twisted in a sneer. "We need to make Uncle see reason, but it has to be subtle. If Graham suspects our motives, we'll lose any influence we still have." The two men exchanged a look of grim determination, a silent agreement that Ethan would be removed from the household one way or another. Malcolm knew he would have to be clever, but he was prepared to do whatever it took to protect what he saw as the rightful order. As days turned into weeks, Malcolm began to orchestrate small but insidious obstacles, hoping to wear down Ethan's patience. He assigned the boy to tedious and back-breaking chores, scrubbing the floors of the grand hall, polishing silverware that gleamed even without his help, and cleaning the stables from morning until dusk. Ethan didn't complain. Despite Malcolm's clear intentions, he tackled each task with quiet determination, refusing to let the butler's cruelty get the best of him. The harder Malcolm pushed, the more determined Ethan became to prove his worth to Graham. But one afternoon, while Ethan was busy scrubbing the floor of the foyer, Malcolm approached him, his footsteps echoing sharply across the polished marble. "Still playing the obedient guest, I see," Malcolm sneered, crossing his arms. "Tell me, does it give you any satisfaction to know you're nothing but a charity case?" Ethan clenched his jaw, his hands gripping the rag until his knuckles turned white. He kept his gaze on the floor, refusing to engage. Malcolm's sneer deepened. "I thought as much. No matter what you do, boy, you'll never be more than a burden in this house. Sooner or later, Mr. Foster will see that. And when he does, you'll be right back where you belong." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight with a mixture of anger and hurt. But he took a deep breath, his voice steady as he replied, "You're wrong. Mr. Foster sees more in me than just a charity case. And I won't let you change his mind." Malcolm's expression darkened, his eyes flashing with barely concealed rage. But instead of lashing out, he merely smirked, turning on his heel and leaving Ethan alone in the foyer, the sound of his footsteps fading into the silence. Ethan sat back on his heels, feeling a surge of pride and resolve. He knew Malcolm's threats were empty, and he was determined not to let the butler's bitterness drive him away. One morning, as Ethan was tending to the gardens, he was surprised to find a young woman watching him from a distance. She had an air of elegance, but her gaze was warm and curious rather than judgmental. "Hello," she called, stepping closer. "You must be Ethan." Ethan stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "Yes, ma'am. And you are?" The woman smiled, extending a hand. "I'm Sarah, Mr. Foster's niece. I heard about you from my uncle. He seems to think very highly of you." Ethan hesitated before shaking her hand, surprised by her friendly demeanor. "Mr. Foster has been very kind to me," he said, choosing his words carefully. "I'm just trying to do my part." Sarah studied him for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. "I know it can't be easy for you here. My brother, Marcus, isn't exactly the welcoming type, and Malcolm, well, he has his own ideas about who belongs here." Ethan nodded, his heart sinking. He had often felt like an intruder, but hearing Sarah acknowledge it made it all the more real. "But you should know," Sarah continued, her voice gentle, "not everyone in this family feels that way. Uncle Graham has always had a big heart. He sees people for who they are, not where they come from. And I think that's one of the best things about him." Ethan felt a flicker of hope, grateful for Sarah's kindness. "Thank you, Miss Sarah," he said, his voice soft. "That means a lot." She smiled, a warm and genuine expression. "You don't have to thank me, Ethan. Just know that you have allies here. And don't let Malcolm or Marcus make you feel otherwise." As she walked away, Ethan's spirits lifted, bolstered by her encouragement. He had a long road ahead, but knowing that Graham and Sarah believed in him gave him the strength he needed to keep going. Ethan's confidence was short-lived. Later that evening, Marcus found him in the hallway outside Graham's study, his expression cold and unreadable. "Ethan," he said, his tone clipped, "I think it's time we had a talk." Ethan stood his ground, though his heart raced as Marcus's gaze settled on him. "I know my uncle has taken a liking to you," Marcus began, crossing his arms. "But don't think for a second that it makes you family. You're here because of his kindness, nothing more. And frankly, you don't belong in this house." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Mr. Foster asked me to stay," he replied quietly. "And I don't plan on leaving." Marcus's eyes narrowed, his tone turning colder. "Then let me be clear. If you insist on staying, you'll be nothing more than a servant. And once my uncle is gone, I'll make sure you have no claim to anything in this household." Ethan met his gaze, unflinching. "I don't want anything from you or from this house. All I want is to prove myself to Mr. Foster." Marcus sneered, a look of contempt flashing across his face. A noble sentiment, coming from someone who's lived off scraps. But don't fool yourself. You'll never be anything more than a charity case. With that, Marcus walked away, leaving Ethan standing alone in the dimly lit hallway, his chest tight with frustration and hurt. But instead of letting Marcus's words break him, Ethan felt a new resolve harden within him. He had faced hardship before, and he had survived. He would not let anyone, not even Malcolm or Marcus, take away the chance that Graham had given him. The following day, Ethan found himself drawn to the attic, a space that had been used for storage but was rarely visited. As he sifted through the old boxes, he stumbled upon a collection of toys and books, relics of Graham's past, likely from his own childhood or from the days when the house had been filled with family. A sudden idea sparked in Ethan's mind. He knew how much Graham valued kindness and compassion, and he wondered if he could use this forgotten space to do something meaningful. With Graham's permission, he could turn the attic into a small reading room or study space, a place where he and perhaps other children from the town could gather and learn. As he dusted off an old bookshelf, he imagined it filled with books of all kinds, the room warm and inviting, a safe space that could bring joy to others. It was a small idea, but it filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. He would speak to Graham about it that evening, and with any luck, he might finally find a way to repay the man who had given him so much. When Graham heard Ethan's idea about converting the attic, his eyes lit up with pride. They had a brief but meaningful discussion about the potential of turning the space into a small library, a safe haven for learning, as well as a comfortable space for Graham and Ethan to share quieter moments together. "I think it's a wonderful idea, Ethan," Graham said warmly. "This house has been silent for too long, and I think your plan could bring it new life." Encouraged, Ethan began working on the attic in his free hours, cleaning, painting, and moving furniture. He even managed to find some old but sturdy armchairs that he carefully dusted off and positioned in the reading nook. With every brushstroke and every book he placed on the shelves, the attic transformed, becoming a warm, welcoming space filled with light and promise. But as the project progressed, Malcolm began to notice. The butler's disdain for Ethan had only deepened, and the sight of Ethan creating something meaningful within the house filled him with a sense of resentment. He saw Ethan's efforts as a threat, a reminder that the boy's presence was becoming less temporary with each passing day. One afternoon, as Ethan was arranging books on a shelf, Malcolm entered the attic, his gaze sweeping across the room with a look of barely concealed disdain. "What is this?" he asked coldly, gesturing to the space around them. Ethan turned, keeping his tone steady. "Mr. Foster and I thought it would be nice to have a small library, a place where we could read and learn." Malcolm scoffed. "You mean a place for you to play at being educated? Don't you realize how foolish this is? You're not part of this world, and no number of books or paint will change that." Ethan swallowed, but he didn't back down. "I know where I come from, Malcolm, but that doesn't mean I can't create something good here." Malcolm's lips twisted into a sneer. "You can play at being one of us all you want, but remember, this house isn't your home, and it never will be." With that, Malcolm turned and walked away, leaving Ethan alone with the sting of his words. But instead of giving in to the doubt that threatened to take hold, Ethan refocused on his work, determined to complete the attic project. He wouldn't let Malcolm's bitterness take away what little peace he'd managed to find. The attic library was finally complete. Graham, impressed with Ethan's dedication, decided to invite a few children from a nearby shelter for an afternoon of reading and snacks. He wanted to create a warm environment where the children could feel comfortable, much as Ethan had described. On the day of the event, the house buzzed with quiet anticipation. Ethan had helped prepare snacks and even picked out some of his favorite books to read aloud to the children. As the first guests arrived, a small group of boys and girls, their shy smiles and wide eyes reminded Ethan of himself when he had first arrived at the mansion. Ethan read to them, sharing stories that sparked their curiosity and laughter, while Graham watched from a distance, pride glowing in his eyes. For the first time, Ethan felt like he was part of something larger, something meaningful. He had taken a small step toward creating a space where others could feel safe, loved, and seen. But not everyone shared his enthusiasm. The success of the attic library event seemed to heighten Malcolm's resolve. He knew he couldn't act openly against Ethan, not with Graham's watchful eye on him. So he began to devise a subtler plan, one that would force Ethan to leave of his own accord. Malcolm's first step was to plant seeds of doubt in Graham's mind. He approached him one afternoon under the guise of concern for the household's reputation. "Sir," Malcolm began, his tone respectful but cautious. "I couldn't help but notice Ethan's growing presence in the household. Don't you worry about what others might think." Graham looked up, a hint of suspicion in his eyes. "What exactly are you suggesting, Malcolm?" Malcolm hesitated, a feigned look of concern on his face. "People may wonder why a boy from the streets has suddenly been given so much privilege. I worry that it may reflect poorly on the estate." Graham's expression hardened. "Ethan has done nothing but work hard since he arrived. His presence here is my decision, and I won't have anyone questioning it." But Malcolm wasn't deterred. He continued to drop subtle hints over the following days, carefully weaving doubts into Graham's mind, hoping to slowly erode the older man's trust in Ethan. Malcolm's plan escalated one evening when he noticed an opportunity to implicate Ethan directly. He took an antique pocket watch, a family heirloom that Graham treasured, and carefully placed it in Ethan's bedroom drawer. The next morning, Malcolm approached Graham with a grave expression. "Sir, I have some unfortunate news," he said, his voice low and somber. "It seems that the antique watch has gone missing." Graham frowned, alarm flashing across his face. "Are you certain? I thought it was in the study just yesterday." Malcolm nodded. "I am quite sure, sir. I checked everywhere, but it's nowhere to be found. Perhaps you might consider speaking with the boy. After all, he has access to every room." Graham's expression darkened, though he remained silent. Reluctantly, he agreed to check Ethan's room. When they entered, Ethan looked up, surprised but calm. He had nothing to hide. But when Graham, with a heavy heart, opened the drawer and found the watch, Ethan's expression changed from confusion to horror. "I didn't take it," he stammered, his voice thick with shock. I don't know how it got there." Graham's face was unreadable, his gaze filled with disappointment. He wanted to believe Ethan, but the evidence was damning. "Ethan," he said quietly, "I've always trusted you. But this doesn't look good." Ethan felt his heart sink, the weight of the accusation pressing down on him like a lead blanket. "Mr. Foster, please, you have to believe me. I would never steal from you." Graham's silence was heavy, and though he didn't say it outright, Ethan could feel the trust between them fraying. Malcolm, watching from the doorway, hid a satisfied smile. His plan was working. Sarah, who had grown close to Ethan, quickly caught wind of the incident. She sought him out, finding him in the gardens with his head in his hands, his shoulders slumped with defeat. "Ethan," she called softly, approaching him. "Is it true? Did you take the watch?" Ethan looked up, pain and desperation in his eyes. "No, Sarah. I swear I didn't take it. Someone must have put it there." Sarah frowned, her mind racing. "I believe you, Ethan, and I'm going to help you prove your innocence." Together, they began to search for clues, combing through the rooms and questioning the staff in secret. Though their efforts were slow, they managed to uncover a few suspicious details, enough to plant the seed of doubt against Malcolm. But Sarah knew they would need more than a few coincidences to clear Ethan's name. She decided to speak to Graham directly, hoping to sway him back to Ethan's side. Later that evening, Sarah found Graham in his study, reading quietly by the fire. She sat down across from him, her gaze steady. "Uncle Graham," she began, her voice firm, "I think there's more to this story than you realize. I don't believe Ethan took the watch." Graham sighed, setting his book aside. "Sarah, I want to believe that too. But the watch was found in his room. How do I ignore that?" Sarah leaned forward, her voice gentle but resolute. "I've been watching Malcolm, and I don't trust him. He's always treated Ethan with disdain, and he would have every reason to set him up." Graham frowned, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "Malcolm has been with our family for years. He's loyal. Loyal to your reputation, maybe," Sarah countered. "But I think he cares more about keeping things as they've always been than he does about your happiness. You took Ethan in because you saw something in him, a spark of goodness. Don't let one mistake take that away." Graham looked down, his face etched with sorrow and doubt. "I don't want to lose faith in Ethan, but it's difficult." Sarah placed a hand on his. "Then don't lose faith in him. Give him a chance to prove himself." After a long silence, Graham nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "You're right. I'll speak with Ethan again. Perhaps I was too quick to judge." The following day, Graham sought out Ethan, who had been keeping to himself, his spirits low. "Ethan," Graham said softly, "I want to apologize. I shouldn't have jumped to conclusions." Ethan looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Do you believe me?" Graham nodded, a faint smile on his face. "I do, and I'm sorry for doubting you." Relief washed over Ethan, and he felt a surge of determination. He would prove his worth and his honesty, not just to Graham, but to everyone in the household. Malcolm's schemes wouldn't hold him back. He would find a way to earn his place in this family. With Graham's trust restored, Ethan and Sarah began to devise a plan to expose Malcolm's deceit. They would have to be careful, but with Graham's support, they knew they had a chance. Sarah offered to help Ethan with his chores, giving them time to observe Malcolm's actions more closely. Slowly but surely, they gathered enough evidence to prove that Malcolm had orchestrated the entire setup. They documented Malcolm's sneaky behavior, along with subtle clues that pointed to his interference in Ethan's life. The final piece of their plan would require courage and a willingness to confront the truth. They would have to present their findings to Graham, and finally, end Malcolm's hold over the household. As they prepared for the confrontation, Ethan's heart swelled with gratitude. He had come to the mansion as a boy lost and alone, but through Graham's guidance and Sarah's friendship, he had found a family worth fighting for. The next chapter would test his courage and the strength of his newfound family. With each passing day, Ethan and Sarah grew more confident in their plan to expose Malcolm. They had carefully observed his movements, noting each time he tried to turn members of the household against Ethan with whispers and implications. It was subtle, but now that they had an eye on him, the pattern was unmistakable. After some deliberation, Ethan and Sarah decided that the best way to reveal Malcolm's true nature was to set a trap. With Graham's support, they planned to give Malcolm an opportunity to implicate himself, catching him in the act. The plan required precise timing and coordination. Ethan would make sure he was around the study, appearing vulnerable and unaware, while Sarah and Graham observed from a hidden spot. If they could catch Malcolm trying to plant more false evidence or overhear him making incriminating remarks, they would finally have undeniable proof of his intentions. It was a risk, but Ethan was ready. He felt a renewed strength in his bond with Graham and Sarah, and he was determined to show Malcolm that he couldn't be intimidated or forced out of the family. On the appointed evening, Ethan positioned himself in the study, his back turned as if he were organizing the bookshelf. He tried to calm his nerves, focusing on the task at hand, while Sarah and Graham waited in the adjoining room, their ears straining to catch every sound. Soon enough, Malcolm entered the study, his expression cautious. He hesitated at the doorway, his gaze narrowing as he watched Ethan quietly sorting books. After a moment, he approached Ethan, his voice laced with feigned concern. "Ethan," he began smoothly, "I wanted to apologize for how things have gone. I realize I may have been too harsh on you." Ethan forced himself to remain calm, playing along. "It's all right, Malcolm. I know we got off to a difficult start." Malcolm's expression shifted, a glint of something darker in his eyes. "I'm glad to hear you say that," he replied, moving closer. "Because you see, there's something you don't understand. People like you, who come from the streets, often bring trouble wherever they go. And while Mr. Foster may be too trusting to see it, I'm not." Ethan's heart pounded, but he kept his face neutral. "I don't know what you mean." Malcolm leaned in, his voice a venomous whisper. "I mean that you don't belong here, Ethan. And if I were you, I'd leave before things get worse. Maybe this family needs a reminder of the kind of people they're letting into their lives." As he spoke, he pulled an envelope from his coat pocket, a letter marked with Graham's signature and a faint impression of Ethan's name, folded as though it had been hidden away in the study for weeks. Graham, watching from the next room, clenched his fists, his face darkening with understanding. Before Malcolm could proceed with his staged discovery, Graham and Sarah stepped into the room, their expressions resolute. Malcolm froze, his hand still on the envelope, as he took in their presence with a mixture of shock and alarm. "Malcolm," Graham said, his voice cold. I think we've heard enough. Malcolm stammered, hastily shoving the letter into his pocket. Sir, I was just... You were just trying to plant false evidence to frame Ethan, Sarah interrupted, her gaze icy. We've been watching you, Malcolm. We know you've been trying to undermine him from the beginning. Malcolm's expression twisted into one of desperation, his gaze darting between them. You don't understand. This boy is dangerous. He doesn't belong here. Graham shook his head, his disappointment evident. No, Malcolm. The only danger here is your prejudice and deceit. Ethan has shown more loyalty and kindness in a few months than you have in years. I won't allow you to tear this family apart because of your narrow-mindedness. Malcolm's face darkened, the calm mask he had worn for so long slipping away entirely. You're a fool, Graham, he spat. You think this boy cares about you? He'll take advantage of your kindness, just like the rest of them. Graham's gaze hardened. Enough. I trusted you, Malcolm. I trusted you to care for this household and to support those I welcomed here. But you betrayed that trust, and that's something I can't forgive. With a single nod, Graham signaled to another household member waiting nearby. You're dismissed, Malcolm. I want you out of this house by morning. Malcolm stared at him, his face pale and his fists clenched. You're making a mistake, Graham, he snarled. You'll regret this. But Graham remained resolute, his gaze unwavering. The only regret I have is letting your bitterness cloud this household for so long. With Malcolm gone, the mansion felt lighter. The tension that had lingered like a dark cloud finally lifted. Ethan felt a profound sense of relief. But he also knew that this was only the beginning of his journey to truly find his place within the Foster household. In the weeks that followed, Ethan dedicated himself to his duties with renewed determination. He continued to work on the attic library, adding more books and organizing small gatherings for the children from the shelter. The space became a quiet sanctuary, a place where Ethan could see his hard work reflected in the smiles of others. Meanwhile, Sarah remained a close ally, helping him navigate the complexities of the household and standing by his side as he grew closer to Graham. One afternoon, as Ethan was shelving books in the attic, Graham came to visit him, his gaze soft and thoughtful. I'm proud of you, Ethan, he said, his voice warm. You've shown remarkable strength and kindness, despite everything that's happened. I couldn't ask for a better member of this family. Ethan felt a lump in his throat, his gratitude almost overwhelming. Thank you, Mr. Foster. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you. Graham placed a hand on his shoulder, his gaze steady. You belong here, Ethan, and I want you to know that, no matter what, this will always be your home. For the first time, Ethan felt a deep sense of belonging, a feeling that went beyond gratitude. He had found a family that saw him for who he was, not for where he came from. As the months passed, Ethan's dedication to the household and the library continued to grow. Inspired by Graham's encouragement, he proposed an idea that had been quietly forming in his mind, a community center where children and young people could gather, learn, and feel safe. He wanted to give others the same sense of hope and belonging that Graham had given him. Graham embraced the idea wholeheartedly, and together, they began to plan the center. They reached out to local organizations and gathered support, eager to create a space that would honor the values of kindness and inclusivity that Graham had taught Ethan. The grand opening of the Foster Community Center was a joyful event, attended by families from all over town. The attic library was moved to the center, and Ethan became its first manager, overseeing activities and welcoming children from all walks of life. He worked tirelessly, ensuring that the center was a place of safety, learning, and friendship for everyone who walked through its doors. The Foster household, once a silent and lonely mansion, was now filled with laughter, friendship, and a sense of community. And through it all, Ethan and Graham stood side by side, building a legacy that would live on for generations. In the final days of Graham's life, he told Ethan, "You were my greatest decision, Ethan. You taught me the true meaning of family and strength." Ethan, holding Graham's hand, replied, "And you taught me the meaning of love." As the sun set over the mansion, Ethan knew that he would carry Graham's legacy forward, honoring the kindness and generosity that had changed his life forever. With the foster community center open and thriving, Ethan's life seemed to finally be on a steady path. But with new success came new challenges. Not everyone in town welcomed the idea of a place that opened its doors to children from all backgrounds and circumstances. Some of the wealthier families, uncomfortable with the center's outreach to those they considered outsiders, began to voice their concerns. One afternoon, as Ethan was finishing up a class in the center's reading room, Sarah hurried in with a worried expression. "Ethan, you should hear this," she said, leading him to a gathering of parents outside the center. Among the parents stood Mr. Beggar, a local businessman with a considerable influence in town. His voice was raised, his words filled with disdain as he spoke to a small group of others. "This place is bringing in all sorts of people," he argued. "I worry about my children being exposed to bad influences." Ethan stepped forward, feeling a surge of determination. "Mr. Beggar, the center is here to welcome everyone and create a safe space for learning. We're not here to exclude or divide." But Beggar crossed his arms, unimpressed. "That's easy for you to say, but I think I speak for many here when I say we don't want certain types wandering around our town." Anger simmered within Ethan, but he kept his voice calm. Every child deserves a place to feel safe, to learn, and to be part of a community. That's the purpose of the center. Some parents murmured in agreement, while others looked skeptical. Ethan knew this would be a battle, but he was determined to stand his ground and fight for the community he and Graham had envisioned. Later that evening, Ethan spoke to Graham about the resistance they faced. Graham listened thoughtfully, his gaze steady and supportive. "We knew not everyone would accept this idea right away," Graham said, placing a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. "But we also knew that building something meaningful often means facing opposition." Ethan nodded, though he felt the weight of the task ahead. "I just wish they could see what we're trying to do here. It's hard not to take their words personally." Graham gave him a gentle smile. "That's because you care, Ethan. But remember, change doesn't happen overnight. People fear what they don't understand. It's up to us to help them see that this center is a place for everyone." Emboldened by Graham's words, Ethan resolved to keep going. If he had learned anything from his journey so far, it was that resilience and kindness could break down even the most stubborn walls. As the center continued to grow, it attracted more children, each with their own struggles and stories. One day, Ethan noticed a young boy named Danny, a quiet, withdrawn child who had started attending the center's reading sessions. Ethan tried to engage him, but Danny remained distant, often avoiding eye contact and sitting alone. One evening, Danny arrived with a bruised arm and a fearful expression. Ethan's heart sank as he saw the boy trying to hide his injuries. Sensing that something was wrong, he gently approached Danny, offering a comforting smile. "Danny, you know this is a safe place. If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here," Ethan said softly. Danny hesitated, glancing down at his shoes. After a moment, he whispered, "My mom's boyfriend, he gets angry sometimes. He says it's my fault." Ethan felt a surge of protectiveness for the boy. He placed a reassuring hand on Danny's shoulder. "It's not your fault, Danny. Nothing justifies that kind of behavior." Later, Ethan spoke to Sarah and Graham, explaining the situation. They discussed options for getting Danny the help he needed, and soon, with the support of the center, they connected him to resources that could ensure his safety. But the incident served as a reminder of the many struggles the children at the center faced, and it's deepened Ethan's commitment to the center's mission. He wanted every child to feel safe, to know that they were valued and loved, things he himself had once longed for. As word of the center's impact spread, both supporters and detractors grew more vocal. Soon, the town council announced a meeting to discuss the center's future. Rumors swirled that some council members were planning to propose restrictions, limiting the center's outreach to certain groups. Ethan, Graham, and Sarah attended the meeting, prepared to make their case. The council hall was packed with townspeople, supporters of the center, as well as those who viewed it with suspicion. Mr. Beggar was the first to speak, his voice filled with indignation. "This center is drawing in people who don't belong here. We don't need to invite trouble into our town." Sarah couldn't stay silent. She rose, her voice clear and unwavering. This center is helping children, offering them a place to learn and grow. That's something we should all support, no matter where those children come from. When it was Ethan's turn to speak, he felt the weight of every child who relied on the center behind him. I know what it's like to feel unwanted, to struggle without support, he said, his voice steady. This center gives these children hope. It's a place where they can find friendship, guidance, and kindness. We're not bringing trouble. We're bringing healing. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and several council members nodded, moved by Ethan's words. Though not everyone was convinced, the council ultimately decided to allow the center to continue its mission, granting it full town support. Afterward, supporters gathered around Ethan, offering words of encouragement and gratitude. He felt a deep sense of accomplishment, knowing that the center's future was secure. As the center flourished, Ethan noticed that Graham's health had begun to decline. Though Graham tried to hide it, Ethan could see the fatigue in his eyes, the way he moved a little slower each day. It was a painful reminder of the fragility of life, and Ethan found himself filled with an intense desire to make the most of every moment with Graham. One evening, after a particularly busy day at the center, Graham called Ethan to his study. He was seated by the window, gazing out at the twilight sky, his face serene. "Ethan, there's something I want you to know," Graham said, his voice soft but resolute. "You've brought so much light into my life, more than I ever thought possible. I want you to know that this center, this legacy, it's yours." Ethan's heart clenched, the weight of Graham's words filling him with both gratitude and sorrow. "Thank you, Mr. Foster. I'll do everything I can to honor what you've built here." Graham smiled, his eyes shining with pride. "I know you will. Your family, Ethan, and this place is as much yours as it is mine." One autumn evening, surrounded by the soft light of the setting sun, Graham passed peacefully with Ethan by his side. His last words were filled with love and pride, a gentle reminder of the strength he had always seen in Ethan. The days that followed were filled with a quiet grief, a sense of loss that permeated every corner of the mansion and the community center. But Ethan knew that Graham's spirit lived on in the center, in the lives it touched, and in the legacy of kindness and resilience he had left behind. The townspeople, once hesitant about Ethan, now rallied around him, recognizing the profound impact he had made. Friends and neighbors offered their support, helping Ethan carry the weight of his grief and reminding him that he was never alone. In the months that followed, Ethan took on a larger role at the community center, honoring Graham's legacy with every decision he made. The center grew, expanding its programs and welcoming more children than ever before. Ethan poured his heart into his work, finding healing in the joy and laughter of the children who came through its doors. Sarah remained by his side, her friendship a steady source of comfort and strength. Together, they continued to uphold the values that Graham had instilled in them, ensuring that the center remained a place of safety, learning, and hope. On the anniversary of Graham's passing, Ethan gathered the children and staff in the center's garden for a small ceremony in Graham's memory. He spoke of Graham's kindness, his vision, and the profound impact he had made on their lives. "Graham taught me that family is something we create, not something we're born into," Ethan said, his voice filled with emotion. "This center is his gift to us all, a reminder that kindness and compassion are the greatest legacies we can leave behind." As the years passed, the Foster Community Center became a cornerstone of the town, a place where generations of children would find friendship, guidance, and support. Ethan continued to dedicate himself to the center, expanding its reach and touching the lives of countless families. Through his work, Ethan ensured that Graham's legacy endured, a living testament to the power of kindness and the resilience of the human spirit. And though Graham was gone, his presence could be felt in every corner of the center, in the laughter of the children, and in the love that bound them all together. Ethan had once been a boy without a family, lost and alone. But through Graham's guidance, he had found a home, a purpose, and a family of his own. And now, he would spend the rest of his life paying that gift forward, ensuring that no child would ever feel the loneliness and despair he had once known. For Ethan, the center was not just a place. It was a promise, a reminder that kindness could change lives, and that love could heal even the deepest wounds. And with every child he welcomed into its doors, he knew that Graham's legacy would live on, lighting the way for generations to come. In the days following Graham's memorial, Ethan spent countless hours in the community center, driven by a determination to live up to Graham's vision. The center was now more than just a place for children to gather. It was a space for the entire town to connect, heal, and grow. As he worked to expand the center's outreach, Ethan often recalled Graham's final words, feeling a renewed sense of purpose with every project he undertook. One morning, as he reviewed plans for an upcoming literacy program, Sarah approached him with a warm smile and a glint of pride in her eyes. "You're doing so much, Ethan," she said, leaning against the doorway. "Graham would be proud." Ethan returned her smile, his voice soft. "I just want to keep his dream alive, Sarah. This place gave me a family. It's time to give that same feeling to others." Word spread quickly, and more volunteers began offering their time and resources to the center. With the new support, Ethan launched a series of educational workshops, arts programs, and job training sessions for young adults. The programs were a success, and soon, children and teens from nearby towns started attending as well, drawn to the sense of belonging the center provided. As he watched children learn, laugh, and support each other, Ethan felt a profound sense of fulfillment. He was no longer just honoring Graham's legacy. He was creating his own. One rainy afternoon, as Ethan was preparing for a community event, he noticed a figure standing in the doorway. The man was tall, with graying hair and a familiar face that stirred an old memory. It was a distant relative of Graham's, a man named Henry Caldwell. Though they had only met briefly at Graham's funeral, Henry was well known as a prominent businessman in the neighboring city. "Ethan," Henry greeted him, extending a hand. "I've been hearing a lot about the center. Graham spoke of you often before he passed." Ethan shook his hand, unsure of Henry's intentions. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. Graham meant the world to me." Henry looked around, his gaze taking in the vibrant murals on the walls and the sound of children playing in the background. "You've done an impressive job here. It's clear you care deeply about this place." Ethan nodded, remaining cautious. "This center is Graham's legacy, and my promise to him. It's become my life's work." Henry hesitated, glancing back at Ethan with a serious expression. "I have a proposal for you. I'd like to expand the center's model to more locations. We could create community centers in other towns, even cities. Your work here is remarkable, and I believe it's needed elsewhere." Ethan's heart raced at the thought. He had dreamed of expanding Graham's vision, but hadn't yet considered the resources or reach required to bring it to life on a larger scale. "I appreciate your interest, Mr. Caldwell, but I want to make sure any expansion stays true to our values. We're not a business. We're a community." Henry nodded thoughtfully. "I respect that. Why don't we discuss this further? With the right support, you could bring hope to more children, just as Graham did for you." Though intrigued, Ethan felt a surge of protectiveness over the center. He would have to carefully consider the offer, weighing the potential benefits against the risk of losing the center's unique spirit. The following days were filled with deliberation as Ethan sought the opinions of those closest to him. Sarah was supportive, her optimism reassuring him that the expansion could work. "Think of the lives you could touch," she said one evening. "If this center could be replicated, imagine the difference you could make. But only if you're confident it can be done your way." Despite her encouragement, Ethan wrestled with the idea. Expanding meant bringing in new staff, overseeing multiple locations, and navigating corporate interests, a world far removed from the community-driven approach he had always valued. One evening, as he walked through the center's quiet halls, Ethan paused in front of a portrait of Graham, his heart heavy with uncertainty. "What would you do, Graham?" he whispered, feeling the weight of the decision pressing on him. In his mind, he could almost hear Graham's voice, filled with the same kindness and encouragement that had guided him for so long. "Trust yourself, Ethan. You know what's right for this place. Follow your heart." Taking a deep breath, Ethan felt a renewed sense of clarity. He would proceed, but only if he could ensure that each center upheld Graham's vision and values. It was a daunting task, but he was ready to honor Graham's legacy in the way he knew best. When Ethan met with Henry again, he presented his conditions firmly, explaining that any expansion would have to maintain the heart of what made the center unique: a focus on community, trust, and accessibility. Henry listened carefully, nodding in agreement. "I understand, Ethan. I admire your dedication to Graham's vision. Let's start small, perhaps a pilot center in a nearby town." Together, they outlined a plan, and Ethan agreed to take the lead on establishing the first pilot center. He would handpick the staff, oversee the programs, and ensure that the values of compassion and inclusivity remained at the forefront. With the community's support, the pilot center opened its doors a few months later. Ethan divided his time between the original center and the new location, working tirelessly to replicate the welcoming environment he had created. Though challenging, the expansion was a success, with the pilot center quickly gaining a reputation as a safe haven for children and families. Watching the project grow, Ethan felt a sense of pride and accomplishment. Graham's legacy was reaching beyond their small town, bringing hope to those who needed it most. As the expansion continued, Ethan faced new obstacles. Not everyone in the pilot town was welcoming, and some voiced concerns similar to those he had encountered before, fearing that the center would attract unwanted attention. But Ethan remained resolute, leaning on his experiences and his community's support. When the center faced vandalism one night, with graffiti sprayed across the walls, Ethan arrived to find volunteers from both towns scrubbing it off, determined to keep the center open and safe. The setback only strengthened Ethan's resolve. "I know why I'm doing this," he told Sarah as they worked to restore the center's exterior. "And I won't let fear stop us from reaching those who need us." Through perseverance, the center weathered the challenges, and soon, Ethan's dedication won over the skeptics. The pilot center flourished, proving that Graham's dream could thrive in new places, creating ripples of positive change across communities. To celebrate the success of the pilot center and honor Graham's vision, Ethan organized a community event, inviting families, children, and supporters from both towns. Held in the town square, the event featured activities, performances by local students, and testimonials from children whose lives had been touched by the center. As Ethan looked out over the crowd, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. This was more than he could have ever imagined when he first entered Graham's life as a boy in need. The community he had found and the family he had built were proof that kindness and perseverance could transform lives. When he took the stage, his voice trembled with emotion as he spoke. "This center exists because one man believed in me and in the power of compassion. Graham Foster gave me a home, a purpose, and a family. And now, because of him, we can give that same gift to so many others." Applause erupted from the crowd, and Ethan saw faces filled with joy, appreciation, and hope. Among them were the children he had helped, their expressions shining with the same light that had once guided him. In the years that followed, Ethan continued to lead the community center network, bringing Graham's vision to towns and cities far beyond what he had ever expected. He ensured that each center remained true to its roots, a place where children could find belonging, families could find support, and everyone, regardless of their background, was welcomed with open arms. Sarah remained a steadfast friend and ally, helping him navigate the challenges of leadership and reminding him, in moments of doubt, of the resilience they had built together. With each new center, Ethan felt Graham's presence, a quiet but powerful reminder that love and kindness could create lasting change. Years later, as Ethan sat on the porch of the original center, watching children laugh and play in the yard, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He was no longer the lonely, frightened boy who had once stood on Graham's doorstep. He had found a purpose, a family, and a legacy to carry forward. One of the children approached him, a little girl with a bright smile. "Mr. Ethan, is it true you built all of these centers?" Ethan smiled, kneeling to meet her gaze. "I had a lot of help, but yes, It all started here with one man who believed in me. The girl grinned. I want to help too. Maybe I can work here when I'm older. Ethan's heart swelled with pride. I'd like that. And I think Graham would be proud too. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the center, Ethan knew that the legacy he and Graham had built would continue to grow, touching countless lives and lighting the way for future generations. For Ethan, the journey was far from over. There were still children to reach, communities to build, and hope to spread. And with every step, he carried Graham's memory, a constant reminder of the kindness that had changed his life and would continue to change lives for years to come. As the network of community centers expanded, Ethan found himself facing a different set of challenges. One of the new centers, located in a bustling city just outside their hometown, began encountering resistance from local business owners. They argued that the center was attracting undesirable individuals, expressing concerns that it would impact their profits and clientele. Despite having heard similar objections before, the harshness of their words struck a chord with Ethan. One afternoon, after yet another complaint from a business owner, Ethan sat in his office, staring out the window in thought. Sarah, ever observant, entered and took a seat across from him. These people act as though the kids coming here are doing something wrong just by existing, he said, frustration evident in his voice. How can we get them to understand that we're not bringing in trouble? We're giving these kids a chance to succeed. Sarah nodded. Maybe they need to see it firsthand. We could invite them to an open house, show them what we do here. I believe seeing the children's progress, their joy, might soften their perspective. Ethan considered her idea and felt a glimmer of hope. That's a great plan, Sarah. If they can see what we're doing for the community, maybe they'll realize how much good it brings. Together, they set to work organizing the open house, determined to bridge the divide between the center and the community around it. On the day of the open house, the center was filled with activity. Children showcased their artwork, played musical instruments, and shared stories they had written. Volunteers and staff spoke with pride about the programs they ran, and several children stood up to tell visitors how the center had impacted their lives. Ethan moved through the crowd, greeting guests and ensuring everything was running smoothly. He noticed a few skeptical business owners lingering near the entrance, watching the activities with reserved expressions. Among them was Mr. Henson, a prominent cafe owner who had been vocal in his opposition. As he approached, Ethan gave Mr. Henson a warm smile. Thank you for coming today. I know you had concerns, and I hope today's visit can address them. Mr. Henson frowned, his arms crossed. I'm here to see if this place is actually what you say it is. My business depends on the right kind of clientele. Ethan nodded, understanding the man's reservations. I'd love to introduce you to some of the kids and staff. They're what make this place so special. Skeptically, Mr. Henson followed Ethan through the center. They stopped in the reading room, where a young boy named Marcus was engrossed in a book. Ethan called Marcus over, and the boy shyly introduced himself. Marcus, what do you like most about coming here? Ethan asked with a smile. Marcus's face lit up. I like the books and learning new things. I want to be a teacher one day. Henson's gaze softened as he listened, and for a moment his guarded expression faded. Marcus's innocence and dreams seemed to reach him in a way that words alone could not. By the end of the event, Mr. Henson's demeanor had shifted. He shook Ethan's hand with a hesitant smile. I didn't expect this. Maybe I was wrong about the impact your center would have on the community. Ethan thanked him, relieved and hopeful that this small step would lead to greater understanding. A few weeks after the open house, Ethan received an anonymous letter in the mail. The letter was scrawled in rough handwriting, filled with angry words accusing him of ruining the neighborhood and inviting trouble. It was disheartening, especially after the progress he thought they'd made with the open house. As Ethan read the words, a mix of anger and sadness washed over him. He felt an ache in his chest, a reminder of the prejudice he'd faced in his own past. This is just a small setback, Sarah reminded him, standing by his side. We have so much more support than we did at the beginning. Think of the kids, the families. They're proof of what we're achieving. Ethan nodded, her words offering him comfort. You're right. For every person who doesn't see the value in what we're doing, there are 10 others who do. He placed the letter aside, determined not to let it affect his mission. The center's purpose was too important to let negativity steer him off course. Over the following months, Ethan continued to grow the centers, carefully balancing his time between new locations and the original one he'd built with Graham. But as the responsibilities piled up, he found himself stretched thin. His health began to suffer, and Sarah urged him to consider slowing down. "You can't do everything yourself, Ethan," she said, her voice filled with concern. "We need to bring in someone who can help oversee the operations. You can't carry this alone." Reluctantly, Ethan realized she was right. He couldn't give each center the attention it needed if he was burning himself out in the process. After careful consideration, he reached out to a man named David Clark, a former educator with a reputation for compassion and leadership. David visited the center, meeting the staff and children, and Ethan was immediately impressed by his dedication and empathy. When he offered David the role of managing director for the center's operations, David accepted, bringing a wealth of experience and a shared commitment to the center's mission. With David's help, Ethan found a new balance, able to focus on the center's overall vision while trusting the day-to-day operations to someone he could rely on. Though David's presence was a relief, adjusting to a new leadership dynamic was not without its challenges. Some of the longtime staff, accustomed to Ethan's hands-on approach, were resistant to change. They questioned David's methods and sometimes undermined his decisions, creating tension within the team. One afternoon, David called a meeting with Ethan, looking weary but resolute. "Ethan, I appreciate the trust you've placed in me, but I'm struggling to get everyone on board with these changes. They're loyal to you, and I think some of them see me as an outsider." Ethan listened, understanding the difficulty of the situation. "They need time to adjust," he said thoughtfully. "But I'll talk to the team and let them know that I support your decisions." Over the next few weeks, Ethan worked to ease the transition, reassuring the staff that David's leadership was aligned with the center's mission. Slowly, the staff began to warm up to David, realizing that his changes were rooted in a shared vision for the center's future. The growing pain subsided, and the center's operations began to run more smoothly, allowing Ethan to refocus on his outreach efforts. One afternoon, as Ethan was wrapping up a mentoring session, he noticed an unfamiliar face standing in the hallway. A young woman, thin and pale, with a look of uncertainty in her eyes. She was clutching a tattered coat, and her gaze flickered around the room as if she were searching for something or someone. Ethan approached her gently. "Hello, I'm Ethan. Can I help you with something?" The woman's voice was barely a whisper. "My name's Hannah. I heard about this place, thought maybe I could find some help." Ethan's heart softened. "Of course, Hannah. You're welcome here. Let's find a place to sit, and you can tell me what you need." Hannah hesitated before sitting, her posture tense. Over time, she shared her story, a difficult past, a series of poor choices, and a desire to start over. Her voice trembled as she spoke, and Ethan sensed the weight of her regrets. "We all make mistakes," he said gently, "but it's never too late to change. You've already taken the first step by coming here." As they talked, Ethan felt a deep compassion for her struggle, reminded of the times in his own life when he had felt lost and uncertain. Over the next few weeks, he helped Hannah connect with resources, offering her the support she needed to get back on her feet. Her journey was a slow one, but as she found strength within herself, she expressed gratitude that left a profound impact on Ethan. Ethan's interactions with Hannah reminded him of why he had dedicated his life to the center. Each person who walked through its doors was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, and he felt a renewed determination to keep Graham's vision alive. With David managing day-to-day operations and Sarah helping him stay grounded, Ethan poured his energy into developing new programs that addressed the evolving needs of the communities they served. Workshops on mental health, job training for young adults, and support groups for families became staples of the center's offerings. The network of centers continued to grow, and Ethan marveled at how far they had come. His life had become intertwined with the lives of countless children, families, and individuals who had found hope through the community Graham had once started. Each new center was not just a building, but a testament to the power of kindness, resilience, and community. One day, as Ethan walked through the original center, he was struck by a sense of profound gratitude. He paused in front of Graham's portrait, feeling the familiar warmth of his memory. "I hope I've made you proud, Graham," he whispered, a small smile touching his lips. He knew that Graham's spirit would always be a part of the center, guiding him and every child who passed through its doors. That evening, as he closed up the center, he felt a sense of peace, knowing that the legacy he had built would continue to grow and thrive, carrying Graham's message of love and acceptance into the future. For Ethan, the center was more than just a job. It was family, a place where broken lives could find healing, and a reminder that even in the darkest moments, kindness could light the way. As the community center network expanded, Ethan found himself caught in a whirlwind of responsibilities. With each new location, his schedule grew more demanding, leaving him with little time for himself or for the close relationships he had built over the years. Though he loved the work, the constant strain was beginning to show. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Ethan returned home and sat alone, his mind racing with plans, figures, and upcoming meetings. The quiet felt heavy, almost uncomfortable, a reminder that his once simple life had become increasingly complicated. It was then that he felt a familiar longing for Graham's calming presence, his steady guidance. "Am I doing this right?" he murmured to himself, his voice barely a whisper in the empty room. In that moment, he realized how much he missed having someone to confide in, someone who understood both the vision and the burden he carried. The following week, Sarah dropped by his office with a bag of his favorite coffee and a smile that quickly faded when she saw the dark circles under his eyes. "Ethan, when was the last time you took a day off?" she asked, concern lacing her tone. Ethan attempted a reassuring smile. "It's just a busy time, Sarah. There's a lot to oversee, and I want everything to go smoothly." She raised an eyebrow. "Going smoothly is exactly why you need to rest. You can't pour from an empty cup." Her words struck a chord, reminding him of the importance of balance. Sarah had been his steadfast friend since the beginning, and she knew him better than anyone. He sighed, acknowledging the truth behind her advice. "Maybe you're right," he admitted, a hint of fatigue in his voice. "It's just hard to step back when there's so much at stake." "That's why you hired David," she pointed out. "Trust him to handle things for a bit. Take some time for yourself. You've given so much, Ethan. You deserve a break." With Sarah's encouragement, Ethan agreed to take a few days off. Though he knew it would be challenging, he also realized it was necessary to recharge so he could continue leading the centers with the energy they needed. On his first day off, Ethan decided to visit the place that had always brought him peace, the lake just outside town. Sitting on the shore, he allowed himself to fully relax for the first time in months, listening to the gentle lapping of the water against the rocks. As he sat in solitude, memories of Graham surfaced, conversations, laughter, and quiet moments of shared understanding. Ethan felt the weight of his mentor's absence deeply, but he also felt gratitude for the lessons Graham had imparted. The time at the lake gave Ethan clarity. He realized that while his commitment to the centers was unwavering, he needed to prioritize his well-being too. The community needed him strong and steady, not worn down and struggling. He left the lake feeling rejuvenated and more grounded, with a renewed sense of purpose and a reminder to pace himself as he continued his journey. When Ethan returned to the center after his brief break, he was greeted warmly by the staff, who noticed a difference in his demeanor, a calm confidence that had been missing in recent weeks. David, in particular, seemed relieved to see him back. "Glad you took some time for yourself," David said with a smile. "The centers are important, but so are you." As they walked through the main hall, they saw a familiar face, Hannah, the young woman Ethan had helped months ago. She looked healthier, more vibrant, and she was holding the hand of a young girl with a shy smile. "Ethan," Hannah called, her voice filled with warmth and gratitude. "I wanted to come by and thank you properly. This is my daughter, Lily." Ethan knelt down, meeting the girl's eyes. "It's nice to meet you, Lily. Your mom is an amazing person." Hannah smiled, her eyes welling up. "I don't know what I would have done without this place. You helped me find hope again. I want to give back. Maybe volunteer here if you'd have me." Ethan felt a surge of pride. "We'd be honored to have you, Hannah. This center is for people like you, who were ready to give and grow. As he watched Hannah and her daughter, Ethan felt a deep sense of fulfillment, a reminder that every challenge was worth it for moments like this. With each passing month, the center's influence in the community grew stronger. Local businesses began to offer internships for the teenagers who frequented the center, and schools partnered with them to provide tutoring and mentoring. The centers were no longer seen as just safe spaces. They had become essential hubs of opportunity and support. Ethan, David, and Sarah worked closely with community leaders to launch new initiatives, from job training programs to mental health resources. These efforts brought even more people into the fold, each one eager to support the mission Graham had set in motion. The success was heartening, but with it came new challenges. As they expanded, funding became tighter, and they had to think creatively to sustain the programs. Ethan's mind was constantly filled with grant proposals, fundraising ideas, and ways to stretch their resources. Despite the pressures, he felt an unshakable resolve to keep pushing forward. The community's support reminded him that they were all in this together, united by a common purpose. One day, Henry Caldwell returned with an unexpected offer. After witnessing the center's impact firsthand, he proposed an investment that would allow them to secure funding for several years. Henry believed in the center's potential to change lives on a national scale, envisioning a network of community centers that could serve as a model across the country. Ethan, Henry said during their meeting, "This center is unique, and it's needed in so many places. I want to help you bring this vision to more people." Though the offer was tempting, Ethan's mind was filled with questions. He knew that expansion on a national level would be a massive undertaking, one that could risk altering the close-knit, personal touch that made their centers so special. "Henry, I appreciate your offer more than you know," Ethan said slowly. "But I need to make sure that this remains a place where people feel truly seen and valued. I wouldn't want to sacrifice the community we've built." Henry nodded thoughtfully. "I respect that, Ethan. Let's work together to figure out a way to keep the heart of this place intact, no matter how far it grows." Ethan agreed to consider the offer, determined to find a way to expand without losing the spirit of Graham's legacy. Ethan spent the next few weeks in deep reflection, consulting with Sarah, David, and the center's longtime supporters. He knew that scaling up would require careful planning, but he was encouraged by the possibility of bringing hope to more communities. After much thought, Ethan proposed a pilot program with a limited number of new centers. They would prioritize small towns and underserved areas, places where the impact of a community center could be truly transformative. Henry agreed to fund the pilot, and together, they crafted a plan that would ensure each center maintained its unique approach to serving the community. Ethan would oversee the initial setup and provide ongoing guidance to keep the mission consistent across locations. The decision was met with excitement and support from the team. They understood that this was a chance to honor Graham's legacy on a grander scale, while still staying true to their core values. With the expansion underway, Ethan prepared to travel between the pilot locations, ensuring that each center was established with care and integrity. As he packed his bags, he felt a mixture of anticipation and bittersweetness. This journey would take him away from the original center for extended periods, a place that had become his home. Before leaving, he gathered the staff, volunteers, and families for a heartfelt farewell. He spoke about the mission they were all a part of, thanking each person for their dedication and resilience. "This center wouldn't be here without every single one of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We're not just a team, we're a family. And no matter where this journey takes us, that will never change." The crowd erupted into applause, and Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that no matter how far he traveled, he would always carry this family with him in his heart. The first pilot center opened in a small town with limited resources, a place where Ethan knew the impact would be felt deeply. He spent weeks working side by side with the new staff, training them to uphold the same compassion and dedication that had made the original center successful. On opening day, families from the town gathered to celebrate. Ethan watched as children explored the space, their faces filled with wonder and excitement. It was a sight that reminded him of the center's beginning, a reminder of why he had committed his life to this mission. As he addressed the crowd, he spoke of the importance of community, of lifting each other up, and of creating spaces where everyone could feel safe and valued. "This is more than just a building," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "It's a promise that we're here for each other, now and always." With each new center, Ethan saw the transformative power of Graham's legacy reaching further than he'd ever imagined. The centers became beacons of hope in towns and cities alike, each one a testament to the belief that kindness and compassion could change lives. Ethan's journey was not without hardship, but each challenge strengthened his resolve. He knew that Graham would be proud, that he was building something enduring, something that would carry on for generations. Returning to the original center after his travels, Ethan felt the familiar warmth of home. The people there had become his family, and their journey together was far from over. He knew there were more lives to touch, more communities to uplift, and more hearts to reach. And with each step, Ethan carried with him the memory of the man who had shown him kindness when he needed it most, a legacy of love that would live on, in every center, and in every life changed by their work. As the story of Ethan and the community centers continues to unfold, we're reminded of the incredible impact kindness can have on the world. If you found inspiration in this story and want to join us on more journeys of hope, resilience, and transformation, make sure to subscribe to our channel. By subscribing, you'll stay updated with new stories that celebrate the power of compassion and courage. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like this video and share it with others who might find comfort or motivation in these stories. Click on the links now appearing on your screen to explore more heartwarming tales curated just for you. Together, let's spread kindness, one story at a time.